All right, so let's just kickstart this session. So once again, welcome to South Asian Bioethics Community's today's symposium on the ethical dimension of food policy in India. Just a quick note about South Asian Bioethics Community, which was started in 2023. I'm one of the founders and then many core members here. And again, thanks for amazing voluntary work, which many of us put here in this community, it's a community which is set up with the explicit aim for bringing together healthcare ethics peers from South Asia and supporting them within the community, especially early mid-career scholars. So we are mostly, it's like we support each other basically to learn and grow together. And of course, we welcome Global South scholars to join this community and be there and learn and connect with each other and networking, whatever the conversation, mainly to build community here we are. And just a quick outline, we are a collective of 8 to 10 members. Every year it's a rotating leadership and we have 54 registered members. So I'm very happy that we are growing and we are amazingly doing a great job because of all the support which we are supporting each other basically. And of course, if you're interested, please do join the community. There's a form which I'll just share the link. And of course, today for the amazing today's symposium, I'm so honored and thrilled to have this brilliant lineup, right? I mean, I'm sure you're all waiting. I'm definitely waiting. So as you already got the idea, the concept note, of course, has been circulated. So just to quickly, situate this conversation, access to food, of course, is not just a matter of survival, as we all know. It's a matter of dignity, justice, and of course, rights. So, but yet we know in India today, or like it's been for a very long time, and food entitlements are increasingly framed as kind of freebies. I mean, not necessarily always in this particular framing, but it undermines the recognition of food as a fundamental right. So deep inequities, which is shaped by, of course, caste, corporate influence, and political and religious ideologies, and of course, technology-driven governance sometimes continue to determine who gets to eat, who doesn't, especially nutritious food, right? So today's symposium brings together three amazing leading voices, Drèze, Mander, and Sylvia Karpagam, who have been at the forefront of advocating for the right to food, nutritional justice, and equitable public policy. So again, I'm very thrilled, and Sabak is very thrilled to host, to have these brilliant scholars with us who will explore the urgent need to rethink food policy or the right to food through a right-based and, of course, justice lens. And a quick outline of the format of the session, just each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes to present their thoughts or reflections or whatever the current conversations which they're into. And then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes of panel discussion. And then we'll have open Q&A for 30 minutes. So what I would suggest is, please, I would encourage you to make a note of your questions during the talks and engage critically, but wait till the Q&A session. And whenever during the Q&A session, please raise your hands. I mean, basically the emojis, and whoever comes on the first, I'll just ask them to unmute yourself and ask a question. And if you feel uncomfortable, you can also put it on the chat and we can read it out. I mean, I can read it out, or speakers, all of you can read the questions. So that's something which about the format. Again, I don't have to introduce the speakers today, but just for a quick, very brief, short note, Drèze is a development economist and activist who has been deeply involved in issues of hunger, poverty, and social policy in India. He has contributed significantly to the right to food movement and has been very vocal advocate, of course, for social welfare and especially within the hunger and health movement. And of course, many of you know his works. Sense and Solidarity, Jola Wala Economics for Everyone is perfect to see the collection of essays of his works. And of course, he has co-authored many works with Hunger and Public Action and Uncertain Glory with Amartya Sen. So I think one of the things which I really like about his work is his research combines rigorous analysis with strong commitment to social justice, and its research and action are always complementary and how it is interconnected. So thank you, John, for being here with us. And Mander is a human rights and peace worker, writer, columnist, researcher, and teacher, and of course, a former civil servant. His advocacy has focused on right to food and homelessness and also child rights. And he has breadth of brilliant, amazing works, and he has been centering around justice questions always at the heart. One of the books which I enjoyed reading is Ash in the Belly, India's Unfinished Battle Against Hunger, and Looking Away, Inequality, Prejudice, and Indifference in New India. And that's Harsh. And again, thank you for being here, Harsh. And we have Sylvia Karpagam, who has made this session possible. So thanks again, Sylvia. Is a public health doctor and researcher working at the intersection of nutrition, caste, health equity, and social justice. I mean, I know Sylvia through tweets, and she has been so vocal and very active, and such a voice which we need always to re-emphasize certain things, which needs to be said sometimes, I feel. So her work critically examines how caste and corporate interests distort food and health policy in India. And I'm sure you have all read her news articles and op-eds. So lasting myself, I'm Supriya Subramani. I founded and I'm a member of SABAC and lecturer at School of Public Health, University of Sydney. And I'll be today's moderator. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Supriya. I'm very glad that you and Sylvia have taken the initiative of this webinar. I see it as a much needed attempt to restore the ethical element in public policy and also in policy research. In the academic world, there is a tendency to avoid ethical issues, as we can see, for instance, in this literature on so-called evidence-based policy, where an illusion is sometimes created that policy can be based on evidence alone. Now, of course, evidence is very important, but evidence is mainly about facts. It's mainly a scientific matter. Policy is a political decision, so one cannot follow from the other. I would add that it's not only a political decision, but often a political battle and often a bitter battle. We can see that even in the simplest schemes like midday meals for children, which are win-win schemes that do so much good, even there we have to fight all kinds of vested interests, like the biscuit industry, which tried to derail India's school meal program in 2008, upper caste parents who don't want their children to share a meal with Dalit children, the vegetarian lobby, which doesn't want children to eat meat or fish or even eggs in their midday meals and so on and so forth. So it is a battle, and to engage with this, we need an ethical compass. And I would add that even if we just want to give some kind of policy advice from a distance without engaging in the battle, if such a thing is possible, we would still need some value and ethics and not just evidence. Now, there are many things we could talk about around the ethical dimensions of food policy. There are many ethical aspects in food policy. We could talk about the process of policy formation. We could talk about conflicts of interest in policy making. We could talk about unethical advertisements for junk food, about the role of corporate lobbies in food policy, about genetically modified foods, about caste discrimination in midday meals, about the ethics of forced vegetarianism, and so on and so forth. And for that matter, we could talk about the ethical aspects of corruption and fraud in food schemes, which are still very common. But let me address what I would see as the most basic ethical question we have to address in these campaigns for the right to food and associated rights like the right to education and health and so on and social security. The first question we have to address is, why should we do something to help people who are hungry or undernourished? Now, of course, ideally, we should not have to answer that question. And I think most of us in this webinar don't really need to answer it because it's kind of obvious. I mean, it's a matter of normal human empathy. Most people don't like to see children hungry, or for that matter, adults being undernourished. And so obviously, from that point of view, we have to do something. But that's, unfortunately, is not always well accepted, in particular by people in positions of power and influence. And that is why in the Right to Food campaign and related campaigns, we don't appeal to empathy or charity. We stress people's right to food and other basic necessities of dignified living. In other words, their right to social security. And I think to flesh that out, since we have to do it to carry our opponents, we can invoke three arguments at least. I mean, one is the constitutional guarantees, including the fundamental right to life in Article 21, and then the directive principles of public policy. All these rights which are part of what unites us as citizens of India under the Constitution. That's one, essentially a legal argument. Secondly, we can invoke the argument of what you could call historical injustice, that those who are in that predicament of poverty and hunger are there basically because of a history of exclusion, from resources, from land ownership, from education, from social networks and everything. And therefore, the right to food is only a small reparation for this history of injustice. I think that's a fairly obvious and convincing argument. And I think there's one more argument one can make, which is not exactly the same and a little bit more complicated, but also quite useful and interesting. And this is what I would call the argument of social capital, in a slightly different sense from the way the term is normally used today. And what I have in mind is that if you think of it, what makes us productive today is not mainly our own labor at all. It's a huge body of capital, knowledge, technology, institutions, and other resources that we have collectively inherited from earlier generations. Now, to see that, just suppose that you had to make your living on your own without any access to that inherited capital. So you don't know anything that you have not worked out on your own. You don't have access to any land that you haven't cleared from the forest on your own, and so on and so forth. You have to do everything from first principles. Now, you can imagine what kind of lifestyle you would have. I mean, you would probably be living in a mud hut and eating roots and berries if you survive at all. Now, if you see it that way, if you think of the resources that we enjoy today as being mostly the product of this inherited social capital from earlier generations, then there's really no reason why some should have a larger share of it than others. And so those who find themselves, because of the arbitrary way in which the market system works, in a situation of poverty and hunger, really should be getting more. So there are different arguments one can make. And the bottom line is that I think we really all stand by this basic idea that everyone has a right to food and to more than food. Now, I want to add to that just an equally simple point about the ethics of policy implementation. What are the ethical issues that we confront when we look at the implementation of food policies rather than their formation? And here, all the experience, at least for me, is that the overwhelming obstacle at every step is the abominable way in which poor people, and especially marginalized communities, are treated by government functionaries, by civil servants, and other privileged people and people in positions of power and influence. Supriya, you told me that you are working or have been working on the disrespect in healthcare. I think the term disrespect is very useful to convey this problem of complete lack of basic respect and humanity towards people who are in a position of disempowerment. This is what we confront all the time. Of course, it is not unique to India. I mean, they're all over the world, people who have no power are badly treated. But I think it is quite an extreme problem in India because of the extreme nature of social divisions, including first and foremost, of course, the caste system. On this, I cannot do better than to quote Dr. Ambedkar. I'm sure that Sylvia and Harsh will have more to say on all this, but this is a relatively well-known quote from The Annihilation of Caste, but some of the listeners may not have heard it, so I'll quickly read it because it's quite telling. He said, "The effect of caste on the ethics of the Hindus is simply deplorable. Caste has killed public spirit. Caste has destroyed the sense of public charity. Caste has made public opinion impossible. A Hindu's public is his caste. His responsibility is only to his caste. His loyalty is restricted only to his caste. Virtue has become caste-ridden and morality has become caste-bound." Now, he's talking here of Hindus, but we know, of course, that the caste system is not restricted to Hindu society. And so this poison is actually seeping through all classes and communities in India. And it's only one aspect of this social distance that separates the administrators and policymakers and so on from the vast majority of people who have the right to food and the right to livelihood. Now, I can give many examples of this. Time is short, so I'll just briefly mention a couple of examples. I mean, we see this all the time, of course, in the schooling system, which is related quite closely to the right to food, since education is a very important driver of improved nutrition. Recently, some colleagues of mine have been doing a survey of single teacher schools in a block of Jharkhand called Manika block. There are 55 single teacher schools in that block alone. There are more than 8,000 in Jharkhand as a whole. So there are huge teacher shortages. And these are not small schools. They are 50, 60, 80, sometimes more than 100 children. And it's interesting that 90% of the children in these schools are the Dalits and Adivasis. So basically, it's in those villages and hamlets of Dalits and Adivasis that the single teacher schools have been confined. And then we hear all kinds of disparaging attitudes from some teachers, not all the teachers, and especially, of course, from upper caste teachers saying things like, "Ye bachche padhenge to hamare khet mein kaun kam karega?" Who will work in our fields if these children get educated? Or another one said, "Ye Adivasi bachche hain, ek ghanta padhayenge to bahut hai." These are the Adivasi children. If we teach them for 1 hour in the day, it's good enough. Now you can imagine if the teachers have that kind of disrespect, as you call it, towards the children, what kind of education they can hope to get. I have circulated 2 short videos on the whole KYC issue, the know your customer issue in the banking system. There are similar issues in the PDS, in the public distribution system. And I hope that many viewers have looked at them. If not, please try to watch these 2 videos, just 1 minute each. But they are very powerful videos which convey the bewilderment and helplessness and resignation of poor people who have trivial problems with their bank account, like a mismatch of 1 letter between their name in their Aadhaar card and their bank account. And to resolve these trivial problems, they are made to run from pillar to post for weeks, pay bribes, get exhausted. They don't get any help. No one explains anything to them. And sometimes they end up being deprived of their own money. One of the 2 videos is of someone who has 3 children going to school who are entitled to scholarships, but they're not getting the scholarships because their bank account is frozen for KYC issues. And the other one, even more powerful, is a woman who has been working on the employment guarantee scheme and should be earning wages, and the wages are supposed to be in their bank account, but they're not there, and nobody can tell her what happened. So what is striking is not just all this running around and the way people are treated, but also the denial of policymakers. Because we have quite a bit of experience of talking to like food secretaries or finance secretaries about these issues, and they are really in denial. I mean, like one food secretary recently in Jharkhand would not accept that it can be a problem for a poor person to have a single spelling of their name on different documents. I mean, this is an obvious problem. I mean, it's because people they may have different names, they may have different spellings. The women may be called Devi, or they may retain their own name. Sometimes they may take their husband's name. There are all kinds of reasons why the names may differ in different documents. But he would not admit that. He said, no, you know, it's the least we can expect from people if they're getting government benefits is that they have a single name with a single spelling. So that shows the kind of lack of understanding. There are also many examples in healthcare. You would know that since you worked on this respect, including, for example, labor room violence, which is endemic in India, the way women are brutalized in the labor room, doctors who don't want to touch their patients, and so on and so forth. So one can multiply the example, but I think the point is reasonably obvious, and this is everywhere all the time. I'll end on an anecdote that conveys how in academia, these simple truths, which are almost not worth spelling out, they have to be told, and they have to be taken into account in our work and in our research. This is about a paper I wrote some years ago, and I sent it to a journal called the Review of Development Economics. And in that paper, I had written one sentence which said, I'm quoting my own paper, the general attitude of government officials in Bihar and Jharkhand is not particularly kind to the underprivileged. Now, this is a very mild statement. I mean, the people themselves put it very differently. They say, ki hame kire mokore jaise dekh rahe hain. Like the BDO or the district collector, they say that these people look at us like insects or vermin. I mean, that's actually a more telling way. But because it was an academic journal, I put it in a very diplomatic and mild way. Nevertheless, the referee came back and he singled out that one sentence. And this is what he said. He said, I am frankly certain that you are right, but this does not strike me as a statement that belongs to a peer-reviewed journal. Now, I found that's quite telling because I can see what he's saying from his point of view. He feels that in an academic journal, you should not make unsubstantiated statements. You have to substantiate everything. But on the other hand, if you don't know this, then you don't know anything, and you really can't engage with any sort of policy advice or anything. So there's quite a dilemma there. I have my own answer to it, but I'll let the viewers think about it, and we can come back to it if in the discussion if necessary. So I think I'll stop here and look forward to the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. This is amazing. It's a very good kickoff of how to center the, like how the stripping of dignity happens in the bureaucratic, in the way the access to care or the way the access to food has been a big challenge when we talk about right to food within Indian context. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to picking up on the last example which you mentioned, especially with your quotation of academic paper and the questions which comes through with academic, the division which we always have, this activism versus academia or advocacy and academia conversations too. So there's more to talk more and explore further. Next, we have Dr. Sylvia. Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was on mute.
Thank you.
So my topic is, still the ethical dimensions of food policy in India, looking at it as a caste and corporate nexus. And just to give a little context, in India, like the last surveys that we've had, the national surveys are the Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey and the National Family Health Survey, which shows that we have very high levels of stunting, which means that children are not reaching the expected heights for their age. We also have undernutrition. Like almost 1 in 3 children have undernutrition and they're not reaching the weights for age. We also have men and women with body mass index of less than 18.5, which is almost like equivalent to a starvation diet. And these do have consequences. They have a lot of health consequences. It affects the mortality, it affects the morbidity, it affects what diseases people have either as children or even as adults. So I'm not going into those. But it's also a fact that this stunting and undernutrition is more in children of marginalized communities. And invariably, the response is that, the women are lazy or they're ignorant and they need awareness campaigns. They need to be educated. This is the most standard response when we hear about these communities, which we call like marginalized or vulnerable communities, being disproportionately affected by these issues. Again, we have very high levels of multiple nutritional deficiencies. So we have, the vitamins and minerals. Most of it is not adequate in large populations, and this data is for children and adolescents. So children and adolescents start off life with nutritional disadvantages. Again, very few people have received an adequate diet. Diversity is very poor. The diets with iron-rich foods or vitamin A-rich foods is very poor, and consumption of animal source foods like eggs and meats is very less. It's very low on an average in all of these, in children and adolescents. Again, when we talk about diversity, there are different classifications. Sometimes they have, 10 categories, some have 15, some have 17, some have 8. But these are the broad food groups that we say you should at least have 2/3 of it in each meal. Which, what would jump out at us is that most of us, probably when we ourselves don't have most of these in each, in a given meal. And again, when you talk about nutrient dense foods, basically they're foods which have most of the nutrients that the human body needs. So it's one thing for a cow to, eat cellulose and do very well with it, but it should be something that the human body is able to, first of all, digest, first of all, it should be edible. You should feel like eating it. It should be palatable. It should also be digestible. It should be absorbed. And that means it has a bioavailability. So, for example, soya has very good protein content, but it's very difficult to digest. The absorption of proteins and other nutrients is quite low, and also therefore the bioavailability is low. But yeah, if a nutrient dense food is something that has vitamins, minerals, fats, also less quantities of phytates and tannins, which are called anti-nutrition factors or anti-nutrients, because they actually reduce the absorption. And foods that are fortified, supplements, lab-based meats, which have chemicals or ultra-processed foods, are definitely do not come into the category of nutrient-dense foods. And among the animal source foods, these are all the nutrient-dense foods. Again, this comes from research and science. It's not driven by mythology or ideology. And just for the record, milk and dairy are animal source foods. They don't come from a plant or a tree. So technically, they wouldn't classify as vegetarian. And yeah, this is just to give a context, just to talk mainly about the two main food groups of like proteins and fats, because they're relevant to subsequent discussion. So basically, a good quality protein is something which provides you all the amino acids, 9 essential amino acids, and the best, in terms of quality, are eggs and human milk. And most of the other animal source foods are comparable to these reference proteins. If you can see the study, it shows that digestibility itself is low for mung beans and finger millet, fairly okay for rice, and the highest for eggs. And most other animal source foods are comparable to the egg. Again, plant proteins, which are mainly found in cereals, legumes, and vegetables, are of lower quality, poorer digestibility, and usually they're limited in one or more of the essential amino acids. They also contain anti-nutritional factors, like I said, trypsin inhibitors, lectins, tannins, which reduce both the digestibility and absorption, and therefore also the bioavailability. There are some things that you can do, like sprouting, fermentation, and certain processes which improve the bioavailability of plant-based foods. But because to meet your daily requirements, you have to eat more quantities of plant-based foods, and therefore you might end up consuming more carbohydrates. And fats, again, have been vilified over the last several years. Fats are actually very important for the body. Different organs, the brains, the hormones, for immunity, inflammation, metabolism. We do need fats, and they make the food palatable. I think this is important to recognize, especially for children who have small stomachs and who need more frequent foods, more nutrient dense foods. You can't just give them a bowl of spinach, a bland tasteless food, and say, you're poor, be happy, because at least you're getting food. Just eat whatever you get. And in fact, someone said, again, as Supriya said on social media, they said beggars can't be choosers. And they said people who don't have food shouldn't expect to have tasty food. And I think this is, again, like what John said, it comes from that whole, caste way of thinking, where you think that you don't deserve, a child who's poor or who's from marginalized community doesn't deserve or cannot expect the kind of things children from well-off communities get. Again, it helps with satiety. So basically, if you have fat in your diet, you feel full, and I think all of us know that. You feel full longer. You feel a sense of, okay, I've had a good meal. And again, importantly, it helps in the absorption of 4 important fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. And again, this there was research, very badly done research, which wasn't actually proving anything, but it went on to affect policy across the world. And even in India, like you go to a doctor, you see even a small increase in cholesterol, and they are immediately telling you to cut down on eggs and red meats. But if you see the dietary guidelines of the US actually removed dietary cholesterol as a nutrient of concern. So it's no longer a nutrient of concern, but it did have huge adverse effects. And like looking at how the caste and corporate agenda manifest, it has many ways of manifesting in India. So you have, coercion. This can be overt or covert. It can be through the policies. It can be through laws. I mean, lynching is basically taking a food that people normally eat, people normally trade in, people are dependent on it for both their livelihood as well as for nutrition, and then you make a law banning it, and then you criminalize that food basically. And if you see the kind of language that is used, it's like people were smuggling beef and people were found arrested. It's made into a crime. Again, you have manipulation, you have erasure. If you look at the policy documents, important documents from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, from Women and Child Department, completely erasing hugely important nutrient-dense foods. You also have imposition, segregation, discrimination. You have gaslighting. If you see the influencers on social media, again, they're talking to people, they're guilt-tripping, they're making them feel that you're somehow at one go by eating certain foods, you're doing harm to animals, you're doing harm to the environment, you're also doing harm to your own health. Again, not based on any kind of science. There's also, as we know, the exaggerated fragility syndrome, where you're okay in certain spaces with certain foods, but in India, if you're a faculty or if you're a student, there's this exaggerated aversive response to certain foods. Again, there's a lot of misinformation, abuse of power, abuse of law. There's silence. Like I said, the policy documents or research which completely erases certain foods. There's also silencing, and there's of course collusion and enabling. And as we know, maybe we don't acknowledge, but I think most of us know that food and eating practices have been affected by caste and corporate agenda. So you have this if you're pure veg, then somehow you have automatically become a general merit, you're superior, you're touchable, you're clever. Whereas if you're eating meats, especially beef, organ meats, somehow you become this person who is a reserved category, you are untouchable, you are impure. And again, conflict literally between what the policies and laws, so-called policies and laws say, was what is actual evidence, and practices or traditional and cultural practices. Sometimes it's there on paper and it may not be implemented in practice. Again, when it comes to the food, the midday meal scheme, the ICTS, how are these contracts given? There's no accountability and there's no transparency. Who does power align with? And again, India is become the face, the vegetarian face of India, and again that has consequences. And therefore we see that food, instead of being framed from science and evidence, and also to some extent tradition, is completely riddled with ideological, political, caste, religion, and now like animal activism and climate, whatever the context becomes that. And we should also draw a line between the vegetarianism of the rich and that is being imposed on the poor. So the rich vegetarians may have more diversity, they might access more nutrient dense foods, and what is pushed on the poor in the name of vegetarianism maybe just cereals and millets. And again, the power is controlled, whether it's doctors or scientists, academicians, researchers, so-called policymakers, teachers, religious leaders, media, everyone uh, come from a certain narrow caste and class groups, and completely control the discourse on nutrition, and therefore the consequences is unscientific laws, economic boycotts, bans on foods that people eat. And interestingly, there was this a position paper on health and well-being, which was brought out for the national education policy, which was such nonsense. Like they said, they talked about sattvic food, and they said, in fact, Bhima and Hanuman used to apparently eat sattvic food, and therefore in the school curriculum, you should talk about these, historical religious people. And then they listed the good foods and the what is good and what is bad about food, and they not surprisingly put all animal source foods, except milk and dairy, which they say is vegetarian, as not good. And then they said it's good to eat the food of your grandma that your grandma makes at home. So clearly, the idea of grandma also is just one kind of grandma. It's, the grandma who makes curd rice, and, the grandma who carries her own spoons on flights and wherever she goes. The grandmas who make fish curry and, dry fish and organ meat, which are completely traditional, completely organic, very nutrient dense foods. Again, she gets erased from this discourse. And we had the corporates, which had very, unethical, bad research, brought in this whole narrative that fats are bad, especially saturated fats. And riding on that came this whole market, this whole industry, which said, low fat, low salt, those kind of foods which came into the market. All the healthy like butter, animal fats, animal red meat, all of those got treated as unhealthy. And interestingly, it was around the same time that the non-communicable diseases started rising globally. And yeah, I mean, this is just some data, but basically, there's been no evidence, actually, there's been no hard evidence to associate fats, and especially saturated fats, with heart disease or cancer. There's been no data to associate red meats with disease. At the most, it shows association. It has not showed causation or correlation. And of course, in February, quite immune to all of this data, the Prime Minister suddenly said that, obesity is far less in India than stunting and malnutrition. But he suddenly decided that obesity is a big problem, and he said that edible oil should be reduced. And the Ministry of Education targeted the midday meal scheme. The children who have the least, diversity, the children who are from the most vulnerable communities, who are most likely to not have access to fats and oils, that group has been targeted by the government and asked to, reduce fats and oils. So we have to really think about the ethics of this, and is it like really policy making? And again, for all solutions, sadly, it seems like it'll be the multinationals and the billionaires who will be saving us. So Bill Gates has acquired agricultural land, huge tracts of land. In fact, he's supposed to be now the largest landowner, agricultural landowner in the West. The focus, okay, I'll just talk about it a little later, but the language, again, there's a lot of appropriation, talking about sustainability, interconnectedness, global solutions, common food systems. And there's the Eat Lancet Commission, which is again a commission put together by billionaires and multinationals. We also have two people from India on it, Dr. Srinath Reddy, who's a cardiologist, and Sunita Narayan, who's she works on climate change. So again, this whole Eat Lancet Commission brought out a report, and this report was facilitated by the Food Safety Standards Authority of India. And their question was, how can we have a healthy diet with planetary boundaries? Like, they decided it's their responsibility to feed the entire planet, and they call for a global shift to plant-based diet. And they use India as an example. So basically, they say shift to a plant-based diet, cut down on animal source foods, and in fact they equate red meat to sugar, and they say you should have alternative proteins. And guess who's going to provide those alternate proteins? It'll be the companies like Bill Gates and all the other companies that are waiting to provide us what they think is much needed alternative proteins. And in fact, they say that they advise more that, I mean, we are, by their guidelines, we can eat more sugar than red meats. And also, if you see the language, they no longer talk about fruits and vegetables, but they talk about plant-based. And most of the plant-based that they are eyeing is to acquire land, agricultural land, and monocropping. So they'll have large tracts of monocrops, growing corn, soya, peas, which would be like an alternative to nutrient-dense foods. And in fact, interestingly, they say that adolescent girls who are at risk of iron deficiency because menstrual loss should go on to have less expensive and without the adverse consequences of red meat intake, multivitamins or multimineral preparations. So in fact, I mean, they're clearly pushing for, pharma products or agro-based products to replace natural and organic foods. So this is some of their statements. They basically say that India can be a model for the rest of the world. If it can happen in India, it can happen anywhere else. And target the adolescents. They say start early. They specifically say do it in the schools, target the adolescents. And that we are a model. So we need to really ask, like, what are we a model for? Are we a model for the anemia or stunting, or the chronic hunger or the different deficiencies? And so it's important to understand that the so-called philanthropic foundations are just a front for industry, which is now controlling governments, policies, and also the resources, and people. Of course, we have our own set of companies in India. These are just a few, and there are many, many more who are now making policy decisions about food for India. Again, like I said, Bill and Melinda Gates, they invest in these products, and they're also investing in research. The research, of course, there's huge conflict of interest where they promoting vegetarianism, they're promoting plant-based foods, and also they're funding the evaluation of this. And then they also, of course, funding the solution, which is manufactured by them. And of course, they also get the profits. And we have like Akshay Patra, our own organization with both a caste and a corporate agenda. They believe in a sattvic diet, sattvic food. And basically they say that all foods which are not sattvic are tamasic or rajasic, and they attribute criminal tendency to it. So they say children who eat tamasic or rajasic food, they are more lustful, they tend to be more criminal, they tend to behave in baser ways. You basically go into a lower mode of existence. And eggs, meat, all kinds of meat, chicken, even onions and garlic are all classified as tamasic or rajasic. And these organizations are not particularly ethical. So of course they come with an ideological agenda, but they're also not ethical in the way they raise funds, in the way they spend taxpayers' money. Because of their caste or religious location, any criticism of them is seen as anti-national or anti-Hindu, or the Christians want to get the contract for themselves, and that's why they're targeting us. And interestingly, in Karnataka, there were a lot of criticism by the Food Commission, by there's an organization called Ahara Nama Hakku. We had the joint director who raised a lot of concerns because children were wasting food and they didn't like the food. And therefore a letter was written to National Institute of Nutrition, which is the only premier public nutritional body in the country. And they didn't even come to Karnataka. They just put out a document saying everything's fine, everything, like taste is good, diversity good, quality good, nutrition good, without even having come here. And later on we found that they had conflict of interest because one of their directors was on the board of Akshay Patra. Again, we have all these other examples. I won't go into the details. You have segregation of eating spaces. You have India being the largest exporter of beef, and therefore, it is a economically very viable commodity. But at the same time, even the suspicion of eating or transporting beef is enough to justify lynching some of the poorest people in the country. Again, there are a lot of other examples and I won't go into that. So we need to really think if these are policies or their decisions or their bad decisions. Are they evidence-based or scientific? Are they representative? Are they accountable? Or do they have any other agenda? We need to start really looking at policies from these lens. And also important to recognize, because we're talking about ethics, there is an ethical obligation of those of us who can to counter this, to push back. I think that's happening in important ways. People are writing, people are protesting, people are challenging. For instance, in IIT, when there was a space set aside for only the vegetarians, the students challenged it. Of course, the PUCL case, the PIL in the right to food case, all of these are pushed back. And I think it's very important. We also have protests. We have people challenging the lynchings. We have beef festivals. And even, for example, in Karnataka, earlier the resistance by religious groups was like 100%, but over time it kind of split. Some said it's okay to have it, and some said no, we oppose it. So I think all of those pushbacks are important and should be recognized. Yeah, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for this. I think it's such an important ways to understand like how the caste and corporate plays out. But I think at the center of what even John was talking about is about how do we, whose power, even which you mentioned, who does power align with, right? That's a key aspects, and how does this play out in the right to food questions? Thank you for sharing the larger breadth and bigger overview for this conversation. Harsh, next, please. Looking forward to listen to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for this very timely discussion. Thank you also for keeping the moral case for the right to food at the center of the discussion. And I'll tell you why I think it's so important. Um, just, just briefly touching base with the paradox of India's continuing failure, profound failure to reverse and end hunger and malnutrition, child stunting, child wasting, child mortality. And the paradox is that India, even in the periods when it has, is even highest growing country in the world in terms of its growth rate, the growth rate has slowed down, but it is still higher than the majority of countries around the world. Our stocks of food grain are enough. I mean, Jean Drèze, my friend here, from whom I've learned a lot, once spoke about 50-60 million tons of grain or 70 million. Doesn't make sense, but he said if you put the sacks of grain in a line, you can go from the earth to the moon and come back and circle the earth a couple of times. And at that time, when the PUCL case was first launched, every second child was malnourished. Today, even today, every third child is malnourished. India continues to fall lower and lower in the global hunger index. The latest was the 105th position in a list of 127 countries, which doesn't mean that that India is not progressing in terms of addressing hunger and malnutrition. It just is that other countries, and many of them, like Nepal, emerging from from a civil war, much poorer, has actually advanced hugely compared to India in the global hunger index ranking. Bangladesh is ahead of us. We are in the proud company of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. And we need to understand why we don't lack the resources. We don't lack the food. What is it that is coming in the way of India's overcoming its sort of centuries old burden of hunger and malnourishment? And we have to, caste was mentioned by both Jean and Sylvia, and I think we need to understand that there is a comfort level with inequality. There's an absence of outrage in our society. And therefore, the solutions are not so complicated, but it's not a priority. With a small segment of the middle class and the rich living lives comparable to European standards, and the lives of millions of others, the fact that it doesn't change doesn't cause outrage and doesn't propel action for change. A quick, because I know my time is limited, I don't want to overstretch it, so I'll make a few points. One was about the lessons from India's lawmaking and the right to food. And both Jean and I were members of the National Advisory Council. We worked on this draft. And I learned a lot about this notion of the right to food. Firstly, if you're talking about just about the right to food and not the right to food and nutrition, the right to food is well known that every household or every person has economic, social, cultural access to sufficient culturally appropriate food necessary to lead an active and healthy life with dignity. That's so briefly. How do you get there? And I realized, just putting it in a very sort of distilled, simplified way, there are three ways that a family can enjoy the right to food. One of them is that it produces the food. The second is that it buys the food, it purchases the food. And the third is that it receives the food. Now, it's, in thinking about the law, I realized that all of these are really important, and probably the first two are more important. But the first, families which produce their food, then you're talking about farmers' rights, you're talking about fish workers' rights, you're talking about forest gatherers' rights, you're talking about, so that's a whole bundle of unfulfilled, why we are trapped where we are. I mean, we need to understand that the right to food would require you to have, to have a system that secures the rights of small and marginal farmers, fish workers, and so on. The second is about purchasing the food. And this centrally is about labor rights. That I earn enough, I earn a just wage, and I have secure access to decent work, etc. And it also is about gender equality, about the rights of disabled people at work, and so on, and the discriminations of caste and gender and race, etc. So that's the second cluster that would allow, that would enable. And then the third cluster is around receiving food. And receiving food traditionally in societies did have, all societies, I guess, in some way or the other, had systems of food charity. And India had actually a very proud tradition of the langar, for instance, which is not just the idea that everybody contributes either labor or food or and so on into ensuring food for all, but also that you offer it with dignity to the person who is food deprived. So you welcome the person, you sit alongside the person, breaking caste and other barriers. So, but in modern society, I think it's completely wrong to say that we have to depend on private philanthropy or religious philanthropy for people to receive food if they're food deprived. It has to be the state. And that is where I would say food provisioning as social security is. And if you look carefully at our law, we actually, in the end, it was about this third. It was about the duties of the state to provision food to food vulnerable populations. And that's why it said, 75% of rural and 50% of urban households would get about half their calorie requirements almost free. And school meals of nutrition, preschool feeding, maternity benefits, etc. It was a long, very complicated, difficult sets of negotiation with policymakers who were fundamentally committed to market growth, and they were ideologically fundamentally opposed to the idea of food redistribution as social security, but we pushed for it. There were still many gaps, and for instance, we argued a lot for not having means testing. I mean, it should be everybody who seeks rations should get it, a universal entitlement, which wasn't accepted. There were many things for the urban poor which were left out. I mean, we felt soup kitchens or community kitchens of of the kind that Jayalalitha had done very wonderfully in Tamil Nadu, where you get very, very decent, nutritious food at very subsidized prices. That was excluded from the law, but it was a really significant law. 800 million people were getting very inexpensive rations and so on. Coming to why I talked about the model case, during the discussions for this, and finally in 2013 when the law came up for discussion in Parliament, I found that the television debates. I used to still take part in television debates. I've sort of long stopped now. They're too toxic. But I used to find that it was a time when even most of the Congress party people were not willing to go out and defend this law. And so I found myself in front of television cameras every day trying to explain what seemed to me a very elementary sort of plea that we were making. And I found everybody was angry, including the anchors. And not only the anchor who's always angry, whom we all know, but every anchor was angry. And I just couldn't understand where this rage was coming from. We said every second child is malnourished. We have food drain, and let's just ensure. So in one of the conversations, a leading and well-respected industrialist turned down and said, "I'm totally fed up." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "So what if I made lots of money? I worked hard to make my money. I've done nothing to harm the economy. Then why should I be taxed to feed the poor?" And it's a moment that has always stayed with me. I realized that's where the rage was coming from. Why should I be taxed to feed the poor? I said, "I'm really sorry. The poor work much harder than you. They've done much less than you to harm the economy. And in a good society, it's a good society when we take care of each other." And I resolved that you can make a very strong economic case for the right to food. I mean, if every second child or third child is malnourished and poorly have not had access to education, opportunities, etc., what kind of workforce are they going to constitute, and so on? So one can make a strong economic utilitarian argument, but I feel we need to stay with the moral argument. What is a good society? And the intense human suffering that is caused by hunger. What does it really mean? Akhil Gupta from the UCLA some years ago tried to do a calculation of how many people die of completely preventable causes in India. And he followed some methodology, but he came to a figure of 2 million. 2 million every year, largely because of hunger, absence of healthcare, foul water, etc. And I realized that the number of people who died in the Great Bengal famine was 3 million. So are we looking at something like of the scale of the Great Bengal famine happening around us every year, and we don't even notice? And so something about caring, something about that moral responsibility is, I think, something that we have to reclaim and center stage in our discussions on. Last thing, I wanted to add to this discussion. Yeah, I talked about the human suffering associated with hunger. I'm sure everybody on this on this panel has not known what involuntary hunger means. And as I was Supreme Court Commissioner in the Right to Food case, the PUCL case, for about 12 years, I spent a large part of that time visiting families, investigating starvation. And it's sort of scarred my soul in many ways. And And then at some point, I decided to do an actual study. How do people cope when they don't have enough food? I've told the story often, but I will still repeat it. I remember a group of Musahar women talking, about various things. And they said, what is the most painful lesson that we have to teach our children? And I said, what is it? And they said, the lesson of how to sleep hungry. And my daughter was still young at that time. And I was wondering, what would life have looked like to me if I had to tell my daughter, uh, I love you a lot. I want the best for you, but there will be many nights when I won't be able to give you any food. And so I can teach you how to survive that food, how to survive that hunger. And so I did this study, and it's a long story with some colleagues, and I found three major ways that people cope with hunger. The first of them is to actually teach your body, just train your body to crave for food less. So you go down from 3 meals to 2 meals to 1, etc. Second is what I would call pseudo foods. You'll find all communities which live with food deprivation know that around their community, especially rural communities, they identify tubers, grasses, mango kernels, etc., etc. The rice water, that is the starch that is left, which is basically, mostly has the quality that it fills up your stomach. It is free, but it's often even poisonous. And so you have to boil it and boil it. Take out the poison, fill your stomach with something that is not nutrition to help you cope. And the third broad way that I find is to make desperate choices. That's a time when you put yourself in bondage. You put your children in bondage. I found you sell your child, and it's something that we blame a parent. I mean, parents have told me that was the only way we felt that she could survive was to give her away. So it is that intense human suffering that we are living with on a massive scale in our country, when we have the resources many times over. Just a small tax on the wealth of our dollar billionaires would be enough to ensure that this ends. And therefore, I believe that this is going to be written as one of the most cruel periods in human history that we are passing through today. We in the middle class in India, among the most uncaring people I've met anywhere in the world. And therefore, I do think that we need to center stage the moral case for the right to food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harsh, for this amazing re-emphasis and to recenter why we need to talk about just approach for right to food. And especially I am just connecting with John's, the first, conversation about, you were talking about how social capital, historical injustice, and constitutional legal rights is important to address this. But the heart is like how dehumanizing the whole process is in order to access, the nutritious food, right? And then going back to your last comment, Harsh, I mean, one of the key focus, at least for me, the way I was taking is the moral failure, right? The way you look at the moral, why there is no moral outrage at this complete injustice, right? I mean, at whatever we are witnessing and what you have been working through so many years and years. And as you said, the suffering which poor people, that the poverty is at the heart of this. At the same time, the complete, undignified way of, how do I put it? It's more of you kill a person through process, but at the same time with access here, with the way you're not receiving. So one of the key questions which I was thinking and, touching upon all your threats, all three, Sylvia's, John's, and Harsh, I'm just wondering, what would it mean to reimagine food, not merely as sustenance, because that's what you were also talking about, but ethical relation between state and people. And as you were also talking about middle class, people who don't really care, the idea of care, if we look at from the ethical lens here, I wonder, people don't want to be taxed, right? The people who are rich and privileged, who are complicit, whether it's willingly or unwillingly, are part of the system, are not able to acknowledge their privilege and power within the system. But at the same time, the responsibility of the state. So there are two ways. One is the larger community, because there's we need to have a larger protest and movement, which Sylvia did mention. There is resistance, there is self-respect movements to push back against the dominant state structures and the dominant values. But what do you think the other ways of the ethical relation between state and people in order to center right to food in a justice approach or the just approach? I mean, each one of you, if you have any thoughts.
Let's start with Jean.
No, I'm not sure how to answer this, but I think the state has to change. I mean, the state is basically not quite what Marxists will call the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, but it's something like that. So I think that the state has to be democratized. I mean, we call India a democracy, but it's not very clear what that means. And I'm not just referring to what happened in the last 10 years, but even before that. I mean, so I think that the short answer to your question is that the state has to be democratized and reflect people's demands, interests, needs, and so on. Then we can see a big change.
Sylvia, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very difficult question. I think more people need to start thinking about it. And I think it affects uh, all aspects, like whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, even sanitation. Like, how are we so complicit and so accepting of, say, manual scavenging, or there is also, the overt and the subtle manifestations. The overt, we talk about it to some extent, but there's also the subtle, in the sense, how are we responding to, say, reservations? How are we treating people who come from, very vulnerable communities into these spaces of power and privilege? Do we recognize the need for representation and diversity, or do we make it so toxic that we always trying to maintain status quo? So I think, like you said, we're so accepting of discrimination and hierarchy and inequality. Yeah, and I think more conversations are important, because sometimes people, like, if it's part of your conversation, then sometimes it does hit people, that because it's so stark. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, if I could
Raj?
add, one is that when we look at the foundations of our republic, our democracy, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. And Baba Sahib said many very wise things, but one of them he said was that even within this, what is foundational? And he said that justice, liberty, equality are possible to accomplish without fraternity, but then it has to be done by the force of the state. But if there is fraternity in society, then justice, liberty, equality become the natural order of things. It's a profound idea. And I think that we really, I mean, there is no shortcut to building fraternity in our very unequal society. Fraternity in English is a problematic word because it means brotherhood and leaves out other genders. But in Hindi, it's a lovely word in the constitution, which is bandhuta, which is derived from Sanskrit, that we are bound to and with each other. We might have different, religions, castes, races, gender, etc. But still, we are bound to each other. And that brings me to, something that Noam Chomsky said. Noam Chomsky was talking about social protection. What is a good society? And he said, a good society is one in which we take care of each other, which is really the idea of fraternity. And I don't know, as I grow older, I begin to feel that probably what is most fundamental that we have to build in our societies is this notion of fraternity. I mean, we had the right to food law, but how reluctantly is it being implemented? The pandemic happened, and for a long time they suddenly, I mean, 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers, and you had no package for them at all. You had no plans for them. And some of us went to the Supreme Court and said, at least give everybody food and minimum wages because you've imposed this. And it was not accepted. It was pushed. Finally, when they realized that there'd be a total crisis, they did distribute grain, but then they had the Prime Minister's picture put on the grain package. So it became like you're some beneficiary of the largesse of the ruler, rather than citizens with fully equal rights and dignity. So I do feel that we have to make our society more caring.
Great. Thank you, Harsh. I mean, touching upon all this, thoughts, I was wondering like how often we think about equality and equity, because whenever I hear even from my own cousins, like sometimes who are really relatively rich, like people who have BPL, people like you want to get, suck from my money. Actually, they openly say this, right? The conversation. So the idea is like we are equal. We earn our own individual money. We earn, but why should I pay for the people who are poor? So the concept of equity is where the key aspect, I wonder, the equity and justice. So what do you think about these different ethical values which plays in? Any comments? Yes, Jim.
No, I just want to qualify what Harsh said a little bit, because I have a slightly different reading. I don't think that Ambedkar said that fraternity is the starting point and then the rest will follow. What he said is that the tension between liberty and equality, to resolve that, you need fraternity. I think that was a very insightful thing that he said. But I don't think we can expect much fraternity as long as there are incredible inequalities like we have today. So you have to do, so it's not like you can start from one and then get the others. You have to achieve them all together. But I think he did make the very important point that if we have a more collaborative and fraternal and cooperative society, then you will not need an authoritarian state to enforce equality. It will be, somewhat, it will be what he said, it will become the natural order of things. And there is a large society in India which is practicing that to a large extent, and that is the Adivasi society. I mean, think of the Santas, who are huge, and for that matter, other communities like the Mundas and so on, who have been living for centuries without central authoritarian rule in a relatively egalitarian manner, not completely equal by any means, but certainly in comparison with the mainstream, quite substantially more egalitarian, and also relatively free society. So we know that it's possible. We at least know that it's possible in simple economies and societies. It's much more complicated in the modern society, but we can certainly aspire to it. And I agree very much that fraternity is a big part of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? And if you have, for all the participants here, feel free to raise hand or put it in the chat box. Harsh and Sylvia, do you have any thoughts or further questions, or do you want to explore further some of the threats which three of you shared?
I'm okay for now.
I just realized, I just wanted to underline that the law was something that was very precious to us. But this belief that we get a progressive law and the problem will get solved. We've seen the reluctance, the barriers, the prejudice against those who are getting their rights through this process. So I do feel, and my work now has increasingly been with lynching and hate violence and so on. And I see them all as part of a spectrum of a brutalized, uncaring society. So perhaps I'm a bit of a broken record, but I feel that we need to restore compassion and solidarity in our society. Otherwise, we make the best laws, but we don't believe in them. And so their attempt, which doesn't mean we shouldn't have those laws, but the laws alone, we cannot put all our faith in the laws. We have to look at our social frameworks. But please, the other two would like to come in.
Sure. We do have questions. So one from Sanchita, curious to learn, considering that animal agriculture significantly contributes to climate change, which disproportionately affects already vulnerable communities, especially through GHG emissions, how can public health frameworks more fully integrate environmental and social justice concerns? Anyone want to comment or respond to that question?
I think this is a
Yeah.
question for Sylvia.
I can go first. So basically, I think that premise itself is questionable, which says that animal agriculture contributes significantly, because there is data to show that it is industry and automobiles and even digital technology that contributes significantly to climate change. We also have to think about first of all, in some of the more like in the US and countries that are so-called advanced, there is a huge market that is waiting to take over the space of food. And therefore, like I said, there's been consistently bad research, unethical research, which there's fear mongering, there's bad data, there's conflict of interest. So earlier they targeted cholesterol, and the fact that that decision had huge global impact, affected people, especially in India, with the collusion of caste and this whole bad research. They never apologized, so they never were held accountable for the kind of consequences that they had. And even now, when they talk about go plant-based, there is no evidence, either nutritionally or in terms of climate change, that is a better model. So if you have like huge tracts of land with monocrops, no diversity, what does it do to the ecology? There's no discussion on that. And also, you cannot just take a model from this unreliable group who have no credibility actually, and then just replicate it to India, enabled by our own governments and our own researchers who come with their own prejudices, and say that you should just replicate it in India. And no activism related to climate change or environment or animal rights should be at the cost of human nutrition. We cannot ask our children and our communities who are already malnourished to pay the price for what you think is important. And I think that's precisely what these bodies are asking for. They're saying, please be malnourished, please be anemic, please eat even less of what you're eating, just because we have some, broad ethical concerns. We want, the animals are sentient beings. Animals have feelings too. They have rights too. And climate change, if you look at the whole climate change issue, in India, we are erasing all iron-rich foods. Like we have cattle slaughter bans. Eggs may not have a lot of iron, but they help the formation of hemoglobin, because hemoglobin needs good proteins, it needs good other vitamins and minerals. And what they're doing is erasing all those foods and then bringing in fortification, which we don't have the pre-fortification mix here in India. We have to fly it. In fact, India is paying like 3,000 crores just to bring premixes from 5 countries like Netherlands, France, and Switzerland, flying it to India. What does it do to sustainability? What does it do to environment? I think all these conversations need to be had, and we cannot just have these elite emotional arguments deciding policy for India.
Thank you, Sylvia. There were other couple of questions which was in the similar line, is again to reiterate how environmental impacts on animal agriculture. I think you already answered that question. The other question which came through is from Aditya Pratyuma. Do we have a state in India which has dealt with food policy well, or even a local example? Harsh or Jen, do you want to pick on that, respond to that?
I think Jean first, and
Well, we know that some states have done relatively well. I mean, if you look at the outcomes, like the nutrition indicators, Kerala, of course, is much better than most other, in fact, all other states. Tamil Nadu is doing pretty okay. And then there are, even in the north, there are some states like Himachal Pradesh that are doing comparatively well. There are various common denominators among those three. I mean, the big common denominator is a huge investment in elementary education at an early stage. In Kerala, it was before independence. In Tamil Nadu, it was just after independence. And in Himachal, it was just after Himachal itself became independent. But in all three cases, the effects were quite similar. I mean, huge improvement in human development indicators, including nutrition. And Tamil Nadu has a number of it has pioneered a number of interventions that were later extended to the country, like midday meals in particular, but also community canteens, social security pensions, and so on. So it was quite a pioneer, actually, in the entire field of social security, and to some extent also in healthcare. So yeah, I mean, of course, some states are doing better and we have a lot to learn from them. They are not models. I don't like this word model at all, because they all have their own problems, including Kerala very much. But they do have some common denominators. And I'll mention another one because there's another question in the chat box. It's not a question, actually, it's a comment complimenting us for saying that caste is the main factor. I don't think we said it's the main factor. It's a big factor for sure. But one could say very similar things about gender. I mean, none of us have talked much about gender, but gender inequality and the disempowerment of women is a huge factor in nutrition as well, for which India has paid an enormous price. And there again, those states have done comparatively better. I mean, certainly not very well, but comparatively better. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from these experiences, positive experiences, as well as from all the dramatic failures.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Harsh, do you want to respond?
No, I mean, I agree with every word that Jean said. I just wanted to describe the Amma canteens just as an example of something that was that actually it was so elementary to understand if you chose to understand. So, working with homeless people, okay, very briefly, I had expected that their malnutrition levels would be much higher than other working class people. But my colleague, friend Vandana Prasad, we worked together and we found a somewhat counterintuitive finding that actually their malnutrition levels were not higher than people with living in homes. And then when we thought about it, we realized that their only capital was their bodies. They have no other capital, and they know if that doesn't survive, then we can't survive. And so then when we did I've done a lot of talking to, I realized that they spend almost most of what they earn. First, they struggle very hard to earn, but suppose at the end, by pulling a rickshaw or carrying loads, I earn, at that time it was about 150 rupees, I'd find that they'd spend 140 or 130 just on food, and there was nothing left. And so the idea of the Amma of the community kitchens that we were saying was that suppose they can buy it at 5 rupees or 10 rupees, then they have a whole, all that other money that they would have spent on the food, on buying cooked food, and they don't have a kitchen to go to if you're homeless, if you're sort of circular migrant worker, etc. So that would then allow them to build up their life in other ways. And it was Jayalalitha's government which accepted that premise. And not only that, what I really loved about it was that it was also done with a lot of dignity. I mean, they were very clean places. I went in to have a look, and I was very happy to also stand in line and eat exactly the same food. And that was the design. And I could notice just from their clothes that about 10% were actually people from, bachelors from IT companies around, etc., etc., which was great because it was adding to the dignity of that enterprise. And they had formed a women's cooperative which would produce the food. They got very decent wages, etc. And when I would I talked to many people, and how much difference this one intervention made. So I think, I think listening hard, listening with your mind and your heart to the experiences of, a homeless person. I mean, very few of us would realize a homeless person, actually, a single homeless person, never can cook her own food. She has to buy her food to start with. Uh, Being homeless is actually really expensive because every time you go to the toilet, you have to pay. Every time you want a bath, you have to pay. Every time you need to eat food, you have to pay. So actually, it's really expensive. And if you understand that, and then you try to respond to it, solutions are possible.
Yeah, thank you, Harsh. There are a couple of more questions. And also for other participants, if you do want to ask questions, please raise your hand and just unmute yourself and ask questions too. Tessa Thomas asks, why do you think the percentage of children stunted remained the same since 1998 to 2021? About 19%. DHS data they're referring to. Anyone wants to pick on that? Or is it, yeah, do you want?
Sure.
I don't think this is correct. I think this refers to wasting.
Okay.
And wasting is, in my view, not a very good indicator of nutrition. It can be useful, like extreme wasting, of course, would be a serious concern. But the problem with wasting is that, wasting is basically weight for height.
Wait for height.
Stunting is height for age. Stunting is certainly very useful, but you see, weight for age, if a child grows in stature, they would become more wasted unless the weight catches up quickly enough. So, and when you look at the wasting statistics, quite often they really don't make sense. Like if you look at the wasting statistics across India, you may find that the worst is Kerala, the best is Bihar, and that kind of thing. Whereas stunting, we do get the right patterns, both across time, across stays and over time and so on. So I would really much prefer stunting, and also underweight, something that has not been discussed so far as I know, is that, of course, India is bad when it comes to stunting, but when it comes to underweight, it's pretty much the worst in the world, with maybe one or two exceptions like Niger or something. And it's not very clear, at least maybe Sylvia has an answer, but I don't know why India is doing so badly. I mean, the worst in the world is like worse than Eritrea, worse than Congo, any other, Haiti, anything. So why the weights of children are so poor? And of course, it's related to maternal undernourishment and so on, but it's something that somehow has not been discussed so much, so far as I know. So I'm for looking at stunting, certainly underweight, but wasting, one has to be very careful. I don't know if Sylvia will agree with this, but that's the way I see it.
I think it's important to recognize that hunger and starvation have come down, but we're talking about right to food, but I think the conversation has to shift to nutrition. It's not enough. People are getting cereals, and they might get one or two of those food groups, but there's very little diversity. If you see the consumption of nutrient dense foods is really poor. And for example, with anemia, you can give them iron, which means to some extent you address the anemia, but you cannot address anemia 100% because you need, you need vitamin B12, you need vitamins, you need selenium, you need zinc, you need vitamin A, and we still have deficiency of all of those things. And so for a child to grow, diversity is very important. So you need both the quality and quantity. So right now, I think we have reached quantity in the sense people do get enough rice in most parts of the country, but whether they get quality food, I don't think so. I don't think the government is removing even the foods that people eat. So the cattle slaughter bans, they found studies show that in those states where cattle slaughter bans have been imposed, the hemoglobin of women consuming beef has come down by 2%. So basically, essentially removing nutritious foods, then obviously you're still going to have all these, deficiencies continuing.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia and John. So we have a question from Tracy Joss to Sylvia. Has there been any study report on the decline in public messaging related to animal proteins? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. There's been so I think most of us are aware of how beef, like you cannot say beef in public, you cannot eat beef in public. There's been cattle slaughter bans, I think, but the way eggs, have been criminalized, it's been very subtle. It's just crept on us. So like suddenly, it's becoming bad to talk even about eggs. It's the tolerance of people has become much less, and like for example Akshay Patra is it's a contractor. Basically the government is giving it funds. The government has specifically said you have to use certain ingredients, you have to provide eggs, and they're saying no, we're not going to do it. And any challenge to that is that you're challenging a religious entity, and it's become so mainstream for people to it's become almost accepted that you shouldn't talk about certain things. You shouldn't talk about eggs, you shouldn't talk about meat. It's okay to bring economic boycotts. It's okay to say it's my festival and therefore none of you can eat meat, and that's also becoming mainstream. It's becoming accepted. So I think that there's a state-enabled, food imposition. The state is allowing this to happen. All the bodies in power, I think, are quite complicit in this. Like if
Yeah,
someone
thank
puts
you,
a
Sylvia, for
Facebook
that.
post and a police goes and arrests that person, it's a society is okay with that. If the number of lynchings that are happening and the response to it is it's unacceptable because people are accepting all of these. It's almost like it's becoming normalized.
True. Yeah, thank you. I just came back from one part of my fieldwork in my Kabaraga community in Nilgiris, and Putbarti Sai Baba has becoming a main problem there for the way the food has been, like, no eggs, no meat in any of these villages in certain areas. And it's because of the religious ideologies and how it's very strong these organizations has been into, bringing into the conversation and making it very acceptable within a larger community. And how do we re-center the scientific framing and then talk about nutritious food within this, environment is such an important ways to think and reflect too. What I would do is the questions I see other questions are around the similar theme. We have another 10 minutes. I would like to center the questions around moral responsibility and the way the state can account and to provide right to food as, to make it possible. What do you think, and what do you think about moral responsibility in these? And how do we think which we can demand? I mean, because it's a right, it's an entitlement, but at the same time, we need to hold someone accountable. Do we have any mechanisms right now, Harsh? Ways we can hold our state accountable for nutritious food, the diverse nutritious food?
No, I think we have to resist any idea that this is charity and that the poor are undeserving and that hardworking middle class people earn all the money and pay taxes, and these poor people are parasites who are waiting. I mean, I recently wrote. I was felt compelled. Justice Gawai is a relatively much better judge, but when we had gone in a petition for the rights of homeless people, he actually said, "How long will we accept parasites? How long will we give freebies to parasites?" And I just I just couldn't, and that was just shortly around the time when this great income tax benefits were given by, and nobody said those were freebies, and so on. So I don't know. I think we need a very consistent, alert public discourse, which does not allow poor people's rights to be converted, as they're increasingly so being converted into the idea of largesse from the great ruler. I mean,
freebies.
the freebies, etc. I mean, to Dr. Manmohan Singh's credit, I mean, he never went once to, I mean, maybe he should have said it once or twice at least, they talk about NREJ or right to food, but it never was something that he sort of presented as the great boon of that was given by the compassionate ruler or something. I mean, it was acknowledged to be a right that was long delayed and fulfilled. And I think we have to be alert in that discourse. I mean, there are many things we have to do, but I do think we have to change our public discourse.
Great. How do you think the language of freebies, do you think we should just, I mean, it's the whole politics, the language around it, right?
Yeah, the selectivity, I sort of give way to Jean immediately, because I loved, he called in, he said that this whole idea that we spend too much on social protection, he called us the world champions of underspending on social protection. So over to you, Jean.
Well, I think we should forget the word freebie. I mean, it's basically a term of propaganda. Suppose that somebody came in the night to your house and robbed you of most of your property. And then in the morning, they came back and gave you 1,000 rupees. Would you call that a freebie? No, I mean, you're getting it for free, but it was taken from you. And I think that's what these social security schemes are. It's giving back to people a little bit of what we have taken from them in the first place. So I don't think we can call them freebies. I mean, that's just a way for the corporate sponsored media to disparage these schemes. I think that's pretty clear. The question you have posed, Supriya, will require another seminar. But first of all, I would distinguish between accountability and responsibility. You mentioned both in the same breath, but they're a little bit different. Accountability is what you do under pressure from something else, from someone else, and responsibility is what you do of your own initiative for your own motivation. And both are important. There are ways of creating accountability, and I think that is certainly very important. And for that, we can use all the means available. We can use the law, we can use public pressure, as Harsh said. We can try to help these people to have more power so that they can demand their rights. And there are many ways of going about it, and it's happening to some extent, but we need a lot more of it, of course. But ultimately, we need responsibility, which is much more than accountability. And there I would agree with Harsh that we need changes in work culture and values and so on and so forth. If you want a short answer to your question, but that itself will require another seminar, for me, the big change will come when we democratize the economy. I cannot see democracy really succeeding unless the economy is democratized. I mean, today we have a completely contradictory system where we have a kind of pretense of political democracy. And then we have these astronomical economic inequalities that basically hand over the system to a few privileged people. And then we still call it democracy. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Now, how we achieve democracy, economic democracy, that is, we would really have to talk about that later. But for me, ultimately, that is what can achieve a big change.
True. Thank you, John. We have another question from Aarti Reddy. With the current push toward digitalizing everything and the imposition of Aadhaar-based transactions onto PDS and MJI, what is the best way to ensure inclusion, given that film is now an inevitable part of governance in India? Any thoughts?
I think, Jean, you should answer that.
Yeah, I think Jean should answer that. I was waiting for him as well. Digitization is so exclusionary and so obviously exclusionary. And we're so proud of what we've done with digitalization. Yes, Jean, over to you.
No, all I would say is that I don't think digitalization per se has to be exclusionary. I think it's the way we go about it that's so flawed. And again, for the same reasons that we've discussed earlier, that poor people really count for nothing. And so we impose digital technologies on them that really don't work for them, and then we expect them to adjust. So we could, if we wanted, we could try to make these technologies useful for poor people. I mean, there's a group called LibTech, which is trying to do exactly that, of putting modern technology and trying to make it helpful for people rather than unhelpful. So we could do a lot more. So I don't think it's digitization per se. It's the way it's pushed and without any regard for the problem that people face. Supriya, you missed one question that was addressed to me. I'd like to briefly answer it if there is time before we conclude. Not necessarily now.
We do have time, yeah.
But we can conclude first on digitization because it's going back to other things.
Very true. Thank you. Sylvia, you had something to contribute for this conversation?
Yeah, just that if you look at the digitalization within the health system, it's almost seen as a replacement to, there might be lack of infrastructure, there are no doctors, there's no medicines, there's no budget, but somehow they see digitalization as a magic solution. So it can only be an asset to a well-functioning system. It cannot be a replacement. And yeah, since we're so enamored with technology, I think the larger society somehow sees this as a way forward rather than questioning this. And the other one point that I want to add is, yes, of course, fraternity is important and it's non-negotiable. But also, as a society, if we want to be modern or, identified or recognized as developing or developed, we also need to look at evidence. We also need to look at science, especially in the context of, say, nutrition. We need to bring in science into deciding food rather than mythology and ideology and, the politics of it, the caste, the religion aspect of it. And increasingly, we are seeing that there is an erasure of data also. There's a refusal to put data out in public. And for example, when there's an uproar about the hemoglobin anemia in the country, they just decide to reduce the cutoffs. And this was not based on any science. It's researchers collaborating with the government to actually make it appear like we're not that malnourished, we're not that stunted, we're not that anemic, that they brought out something like a gene diet theory where they said, not genres, but yeah, gene diet theory, where they said Indians are naturally small, hemoglobin is naturally lower than, say, other countries. And I think that is a very dangerous trend where we are normalizing what is completely unacceptable and completely abnormal. That's happening, I think, on a very large scale, and most people are very accepting of it because we just so love the idea of a country that is, you're anti-national just to question it. And I think being more questioning, asking for hard data, asking for evidence, asking for policies that are evidence-based, I think that is very crucial at this point in time.
Thank you, Sylvia. Harsh, do you have any thoughts on this or?
No.
Thank you, Harsh. John, do you want to respond to the question, which I missed? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a question about, it refers to an article where I apparently said that I had become a vegetarian out of concern for animals, and,
Okay.
asking what is my view today.
Yeah.
My personal experience is of no great importance for this webinar, but let me explain a little bit what I went through. When I was a young man, when I was still at school, I worked on a pig farm for some time, quite some time in Belgium. And I was really quite disgusted with the way the animals were treated. I mean, the piglets are castrated, their teeth are cut, and then the mother is kept in a very small enclosure where she cannot lie down, because if she lies down, she may crush the piglets and so on. So it's really quite atrocious. And so I became a vegetarian. Now, that was in a society where there's no caste system, and the politics of vegetarianism are quite different. And I think people there do eat too much meat. I don't know if Sylvia will agree, but I think that's my understanding. Having said this, I was never a so-called pure vegetarian. If somebody offers me meat, I feel free to decide, because the animal is already dead, and it's not like a vow. It's not like a religious vow that, oh, if you eat one piece of meat, then you've lost your vegetarian status. It's not like that. It's basically a kind of habit, a dietary habit. Now, of course, in India, things are a bit different. I became more aware of the politics of it, including under the influence of Sylvia and others. I realized the link with the caste system, the oppressive aspect of vegetarianism. So I became a bit less enthusiastic, and I don't think today I would qualify as a vegetarian. I do eat meat from time to time. But one thing that made me change my mind also is the realization as an economist that the most miserable animal in India by far is the cow. And that's because the cow has no economic value. The goat is much happier. The goats, you feed them, you graze them because you want them to become well nourished, so that when you kill them, they have value. Then, of course, at the end, they get killed. But then, everyone's life ends somewhere, sometime or the other. And the goats are killed in a reasonably, less cruel manner. You just behead them, and it doesn't take very long. The cows die over a long period of time through all kinds of suffering because they have no economic value. Once they stop giving milk, if they give milk, then of course they will be very well fed. But then after that, they are left neglected and to die a horrible death. So the point is that a domestic animal, I'm not talking necessarily all animals, but at least a domestic animal could paradoxically may be better off being eaten at the end of their life rather than spending a horrible life because they have no economic value. So for that reason also, I became much less particular. I still care for animals. I do very much. And I still don't eat much meat, but I see it very differently from the way I used to. I don't know if that answers the question, but anyway, here we go.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sylvia and Harsh. We are almost close to the wrap-up time. But first of all, thank you so much again for this brilliant insights, experiences, and share. I mean, it's good to learn more about Joe a little bit more. And I think to reiterate what Harsh was also mentioning, and even John and Sylvia, is like, how do we center from the ethical dimension, the conversations of food, and especially the right to food? I think it's such an important, and I think it's a continuing conversation. I think we have been doing this for many years. You have been, leading voices in this whole movement, and I'm sure this is part of the continuing movement. And I would see it as a part of self-respect movement, to have a food sovereignty is so important with the three things of purchase. Harsh was talking about. So I value these conversations, and thank you so much for all the participants for patiently, listening to us and engaging with us through chats mostly. But next time, hopefully more questions with unmuting yourself. So thank you so much again for everyone to being here, and thanks for all of you.